Howdy y'all. Once again, this video contains spoilers for all of Deltarune. This time though, this is part 2 to my last video, and this one will make a lot more sense if you watch that video first. It will be in the upper right corner if I've figured out how to do that properly. Before all this gets started, I want to really, truly thank you for all the comments on the first video. There were so many that it would take me a full day to respond to them all, so this is the only way I can thank you all properly. I especially want to thank those of you who said you liked my voice or narration. I'm a little self-conscious about those, so it makes me feel warm inside when you say you like those, so thank you. Reading all those comments made me decide to make this part 2 video. There's a lot of comments that challenge my thoughts on this topic, and a lot of extra evidence people provided that I wanted to add on to the original video. Who knows, maybe those comments completely changed my opinion on the original theory. This video is going to be completely all over the place, I'm so sorry. The most important thing I noticed while reading comments is that I kind of forgot some people think of the soul we control as Kris's soul. My interpretation has always been that it is literally us, that it's our soul, and I've blocked out that some people think differently. Here are some reasons why I think the soul is literally us and that we aren't just possessing Kris's soul. Firstly, I want to mention that the song that plays when you're sealing dark fountains is literally titled Your Power. To me, this title means that the power to seal dark fountains is completely our own, that it's tied directly to the player and not Kris. And that power does come directly from the soul, considering it literally floats into the source of the dark fountain, which means that the soul would also belong purely to us, and not to Kris. Some people will call a song name flimsy evidence at best, and yeah, sure, it could be referring to Kris, but song titles are something only the player can see. Kris will never ever see the song title, and therefore would never refer to Kris as you. It must be the player's power specifically. To me, it's difficult to assume possession is what gives you this power. Instead, I think it's more likely the soul we control is special, which makes me think the soul is tied directly to us and not to Kris. For my next trick, I want to mention the vessel creation again. But before I do, there's more evidence that this sequence was interrupted that I forgot to mention in the first video. I mentioned last time that the font changes at the end, which is wrong by the way, it just changes from all caps to normal capitalization. Both these speakers are actually the default font, but the first one has that weird bubble letter glow around it. The capitalization isn't the only thing that changes in the vessel creation though. Two other things change as well. One change is the background, which is especially interesting because the original background is a ripply pattern that can also be seen in Dark Worlds, such as here at the end of chapter 3. The other change is the music, which completely cuts out during this ending shift. I think it's easy to explain away the capitalization because some characters speak in multiple different fonts even, namely Sans, but I'd like to mention that his font changes from Comic Sans to Sans Serif, which still fits his theme of Sansness. In my opinion though, the capitalization difference feels like a uniquely Toby Fox-esque character differentiator, especially since we see this first character again, talking with the same capitalization when you lose the night fight and again at the end of chapter 4. The music change could also be perceived as non-diegetic. I believe this even less though personally. I'm not sure Mr. Fox even knows he can make something non-diegetic. I'm not even kidding, even the area themes are non-diegetic in this game. If you play the Sanctuary theme on the grand piano, Susie will say Ralsei was humming the theme the whole time, which means he can hear it. Is there any part of this game safe from being literal? If you look at these changes individually, I think you can rationalize the music and capitalization to be meaningless, but when they are combined with the background change, it seems much more likely we were stolen from the original speaker and brought somewhere else. Some people also brought up that when you use a name such as Kris, Susie, or Noelle, the entity says that we are about to meet someone very, very wonderful. This could be seen as the entity knowing that we're going to be sent to Kris, but I don't think that has to be the case. One possibility is that we were supposed to meet these three as the vessel. At no point does the entity say that we are going to meet them within Kris's body, just that we'll meet them. Another possibility is that the entity knows what's about to happen, but it's not their original intention. They could be stuck in a loop, watching over every time someone new plays the game. They always know what's going to happen, but this is the entity's role. This is the way the story has to go. Why was I talking about this again? Oh right, when we are summoned at the very beginning of the game, the red soul appears on the screen. The animation also seems to make it very clear that we were teleported into the world like this, as the soul. So the fact that this sequence is interrupted implies that the group that brought us to this world is not the same as the one that places us within Kris. That means this soul can't be Kris's soul because we inhabit it way before Kris was ever involved with the soul. If we were possessing Kris's soul, then Kris would have had to be there when we were transferred into this soul. Since it doesn't seem likely that Kris had anything to do with the beginning of the vessel creation, it's hard to imagine that you possess their soul instead of being an entirely new soul, which is why I believe we are an entirely new soul. There isn't a concrete answer to whose soul it is though. I very well could be wrong in my analysis. There's a few reasons that other people think this is Kris's soul. One important factor is the long-held belief that Kris had nothing to do with your possession. Since if Kris didn't know this was happening, you must have possessed their soul because, as far as we know, every character needs a soul. On top of that, Kris also seems to be zombified in the early chapters when the soul is taken out. For some people, that might be enough evidence until we're told otherwise. To me though, it's not, especially since Kris was probably faking their weakness. Speaking of being told otherwise though, many people brought up the fact that in the fights against the Spawn and Jackenstein, the text box says that Kris's soul emitted a bright light. This would seem to prove that I'm completely wrong, but don't worry, I have two last tricks up my sleeve. When Kris enters a dark world, you and them are combined into one being. That's why Kris never removes you in a dark world, because they might not be able to. Within the dark world, you act as Kris's soul, and the dark world treats you as if you have always been Kris's soul. This would explain why the text box would refer to you as Kris's soul even if you actually aren't. Also, during the Titan fight, it is specifically referred to as your soul in the same type of text. A very strange difference for that one particular fight. I think that might mean Kris could have defeated the Spawn and Jackenstein with their actual soul, and so the dark world thinks you're Kris's soul. But in the Titan fight, you, the player, are the only one who could have defeated the Titan. Kris's real soul would not have been able to glow bright enough. That makes the dark world see you as your own soul, separate from Kris. Another reason people think we're inhabiting Kris's soul is that they take damage during the weird route after kicking you in the trash can. I think this one can be easily explained by the fact that they only seem to be hurt from it after they place the soul back within themselves. This would lead me to think the damage is more tied to the soul rather than Kris themselves. Those are the reasons why I think it's our soul, but if you disagree with me, that's fine. I don't think it's incredibly important to the overall theory that Kris forces you to possess them anyways. Now, I want to spend some time going over more evidence that Kris summoned you, and why they would summon you in the first place. I first want to mention another detail that a quarter of the comments brought up, and it revolves around one Caddy Kattenheimer. When you're traversing Hometown at the end of Chapter 2, chatting with Caddy will have her mention that she and Kris used to study occult together. Occult is usually associated with the summoning of demons, and well, I'm not going to directly call you a demon, but you're about as powerful as one in Deltarune. I chose not to include this in the first video because, as I've already said, I don't think Kris is the one who summoned us first, so the occult summoning probably wasn't from them. Something I should have considered though is that Kris could have been the one responsible for transferring us to them. They don't have to be the one to first summon us for this detail to matter. The reason I overlooked this is because I always thought that since Gaster was the one to bring us here, yes, I'm very sorry Gaster deniers for bringing him up, stay with me for a second. Since Gaster is the supernatural fellow hanging over all our heads, I figured if someone is able to transport us to Kris, they would have to also be supernatural. That led me to think it was more likely the work of the Knight or Friend or someone like that. But why should I so easily assume that Kris couldn't transport you? The real problem is that the game is only halfway done, and I'm trying to predict something we probably don't have all the evidence for yet. I think Kris's connection to summonings with Caddy should have been mentioned in the first video at the very least. Speaking of Kris's plans to bring you here, you all really hated my thoughts on the cage. And oh my moons do I mean you really hated it. I claim Kris bought the cage and people absolutely despise that thought. For clarification, I literally just threw that out there. It doesn't matter how they got it there, just that they got it to contain you. As I said in the last video, they literally self-admit to having the cage for you. Speaking of the cage though, people also said that Kris could not have gotten the cage recently because it's damaged, which is a terribly stupid argument for two reasons. The first being that they could have taken a cage that was already used by someone else, it doesn't have to be a brand new cage. The second reason is that the cage isn't even the thing that's damaged. I was even accused of not being able to read by people because of this. That got me irrationally angry, so now we're breaking down sentences in this video, sorry. Here's the full line. Every sentence in English has a subject. The contentious part of this topic is which object is the subject of the second sentence. In the first sentence, the wagon is the subject because it's the first object that appears in the sentence. A preposition, with, also follows the wagon and describes something on the wagon. The sentence revolves around the wagon, making it the subject. The second sentence only uses the word it's though, which makes the second sentence's subject unclear. The default subject for this would be the subject of the last sentence, like if you use someone's name and then say they in the next sentence. In this case, the previous subject was the wagon, not the cage. We can also use our context clues and see that the object crashes a lot. It would be reasonable for a pseudo-vehicle like a wagon to be involved in many crashes. It would not be reasonable for a birdcage to be in many crashes unless Kris is repeatedly throwing it against the wall. I do believe that Kris would do something like that, but I think it's more likely that the wagon has been in a lot of crashes since it was most likely used often by 2 to 4 children. Sentence analysis over. Hope you enjoyed! As one final quick point for Kris being the one to contain you, Kris's prophecy name is equally interesting. If we are a parasite to Kris, then why is Kris called the Cage? A cage is specifically meant to trap something inside it. Therefore, Kris is meant to keep you inside them. That would mean that Kris is aware of their role in keeping you from escaping them, which is why they prevent you from leaving when you're removed from their body. Moving on from evidence that Kris did acquire you, I want to go back to why Kris would acquire you in the first place. I want to talk about a Japanese translation that many people mentioned on the last video. It revolves around the kitchen scene in the holiday house. Within that scene, the Japanese translation is a lot more direct and informative than the English version. In the English version, the voice says, "Kris, Dark World, no soul, can't," as I showed in the last video. The Japanese version is more specific though. According to multiple people, including this user on Twitter, the Japanese translation seems to directly imply that Kris cannot enter Dark Worlds without the soul. Normally, I would be at best skeptical of a translation and assume it's just a mistranslation, but the translator is Mr. Fox himself, so I think it's very solid evidence. My only concern would be why the English version doesn't have the same meaning. Since Mr. Fox is bilingual, it would make more sense if the line was translated as close as possible instead of adding additional meaning to one version over the other. It feels extremely unnecessary to withhold such an important detail because of a language difference, which is why I'd be inclined to believe this line doesn't actually mean much. We probably won't know for sure until the full game releases though. I'm still more attached to the idea that we are needed to seal dark fountains anyways. The Your Power song plays while you're sealing dark fountains after all, which seems like the biggest clue that only you can seal fountains. Some people also brought up the aftermath of the Spamton fight, where Kris screams out in distress if you choose no. I don't think Kris's reaction is from realizing they're being controlled by us or trapped by us. I think it's a reaction to what could happen to them if the strings are cut. Your connection to Kris is paralleled by Spamton's connections to his strings, holding him within this world and preventing him from being free. Spamton determines he needs you to save him, just like Kris must have thought. When the strings are cut though, Spamton collapses. It appears as if he dies when his strings are cut. So if Kris was ever separated from you for long enough, maybe something similar happens to them. That's why Kris is in anguish. It's the realization that they might need you even more than they thought. There's some other connections between Kris and you that I couldn't find a good place for in a specific section, but I still want to mention them. The reason this section is called Krismas Holiday is a puzzle for you to solve. There are some heart-shaped pillows in the holiday house right near the parents' bedroom. Currently only Carol is sleeping in there because Rudy is stuck in the hospital, so the heart-shaped pillows most likely connect Carol to you directly, especially since Noelle mentions she's the one that collects them, further implying that Carol had something to do with you possessing Kris. If you interact with the pillows while Noelle's with you, she'll say this: "When Kris was little, they'd take one of these, then pretend to rip their heart out and chase me." This would seem to sublimate my point that Kris would have no knowledge of how to rip their soul out to gas, and yeah, I guess this is somehow common knowledge for them, or just instinctual for some reason. My only pushback would be that Kris is clearly in pain while doing this for the first time. Any rational person would stop trying to pull their soul out while in immense pain, but Kris knows for a fact this will work. To me, that probably means Kris was told they could do that, or this has happened before. Both are possible, but I think it would be a little too convoluted if Kris was possessed before we got here. People around town talk about Kris similarly, and Noelle has known Kris since childhood and seemingly thinks this time period after we start the game is when Kris has been acting particularly weird. She probably wouldn't have the same reaction to Kris's personality change if this is something that has happened before. I want to talk about Carol a tiny bit longer. Some people disagree with the fact that Carol was the one on the phone, but I really don't see why. Kris uses the phone after the guitar is stolen, and the person on the other line says they will be right there. Carol then shows up, with Noelle saying she's home earlier than she was supposed to be. She then takes the guitar from Susie, which completely solves the problem Kris and the voice had. I think people are trying to outsmart the story too much here. The person Kris called in the closet literally has to be Carol. If you want to argue that there are two different callers, I think you have an argument. But in this specific situation, Kris was 100% calling Carol. It doesn't really matter who is calling Kris during the kitchen scene anyways. I just assume it's Carol because Kris has called them before and she's the only character we know for certain that Kris is working with. There was one commenter in particular that said this theory falls apart because it destroys the themes of freedom. I want to mention that argument because I couldn't disagree more with any qualms in this theory. I believe every theory should make sense from a story perspective first, and I never would have considered the original theory if I thought there was any chance of making no sense thematically. Themes are not just about looking at one side of a particular topic. Jevil thinks being oblivious to the outside world is being free, but that's never seen as actually good by the story. Ram says that Kris enjoys more freedom, and I think it's likely he's right. That doesn't mean Kris burdening themselves with the soul wouldn't make sense though. Giving away some of your freedom to reach a certain goal is developing the themes of freedom, not completely tossing them aside. It values freedom just as much, if not more, making it a pseudo-currency instead of something that can only be gained. Freedom is an incredibly important part of Kris's character, but even Ram's attempts to give Kris more freedom by playing the original Mantle game are useless. The game is controlled by us, and there's not even any freedom within the game. The only option to progress the Mantle games is by killing monsters. It's a completely linear path. That doesn't sound like freedom to me. That's still a development of the theme of freedom though, enhancing how important freedom is by showing what a lack of it is like, which is very similar to Kris's lack of freedom within the actual game, and adding an extra layer to Kris's freedom by having their limited freedom be self-inflicted is an expansion of this theme. While I'm talking about freedom in the Mantle game though, I want to quickly redress the weird root again. I think my analysis of the weird root is the worst part of the original video, both because it was completely unnecessary to the theory, and the actual analysis was really bad. I think the weird root is trying to get you to stop playing it, but I don't think it means that you're an outright bad person for playing it. At the end of the day, it really is a game, and I think Mr. Fox knows that better than anyone. I do think terrible things will happen upon finishing the weird root though. This is due to Ralsei's line after Susie sees the last prophecy, and from how Noelle and Kris become used up during the last Mantle game, foreshadowing something similar happening at the end of the weird root. I wanted to talk about the weird root in the original video because I wanted to show what it's like when the game actively tries to make you feel bad. I wanted to contrast how the normal route makes you feel unwanted by Kris with the weird route trying to give you a sick feeling in your stomach. The weird route helps to show what happens when you take advantage of the power disparity between you and Kris. There was a much better video released a day before I posted my video that does a much better job at analyzing your dynamic with Kris. I will leave a link in the description and the eye icon if I can figure it out, so I recommend you watch it after this video because my attempt will not be as detailed. It's very noticeable that Kris has limited control over their actions. They are given a command by you through the dialogue prompts, but they can twist some of them. One example is that the prompts don't say how exactly Kris has to say those lines. As I said earlier, after the Spamton fight they will shout no loud enough to scare even Susie, or if you say yes, they will say it very unconvincingly. There's also the fact that Kris will sometimes act without your prompting. Some examples of this are jumping in to save Susie from the Spade King, playing the piano very badly on purpose, and even something like holding back against the knight, shown by them doing less damage than Ralsei. Kris's freedoms aren't being completely taken away, and they still have a ton of control, especially since they can rip you from their body when they feel it necessary. It's not a completely one-sided dynamic where either Kris or you are the victim, except in the weird route because you can choose to take advantage of your power, while Kris is always just Kris. They won't take as much advantage as they probably can because they need you for something, or else there's no reason they wouldn't throw you in with Onion-san in the weird route. Thank you so much for watching. I'm really sorry this video is almost as long as the first part, but I hope you at least enjoyed it. I'm going to try harder to respond to comments this time, but I felt bad having to choose which comments to reply to last time, so I just kind of froze and chose to respond to none. Also, I'm not responding to your comment if you don't use they them for Kris. Them's the rules. Before I go, I want to quickly say that this theory is completely my own analysis and opinion. If you disagree with me, that's completely fine. The story's unfinished and there's no concrete evidence for anything right now. The only theory I'm 100% confident in across both videos is that Kris created the Dark Fountain, because I really want it to be true because I think it's cool. I think Kris will only become more and more interesting as the chapters go on, even though I already think they're the most interesting aspect of the story. Your relationship with Kris is what makes this game so different from every other game I've played, especially if this theory is right because Kris choosing you makes their dynamic with you even more interesting. I can't wait for when I'm most likely proven wrong in the first 5 minutes of Chapter 5. I was also really inspired by people's comments encouraging me to make the Susie video, so it might take a while, but I promise it will be the next video. Thank you all again so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. The capitalization difference feels like a uniquely Toby Fox-esque character wow, that is a tongue twister if I've ever heard one, wow.